Hey guys! So here we are at chapter 11 of the Count of Monte Cristo, The 100 Days. Events followed one another very rapidly. Everyone knows the history of the famous return from Elba, a return which, unexampled as it was in the past, will probably remain unimitated in the future. Louis XVIII made but a feeble attempt to parry the blow. The monarchy, which he had but ill reconstructed, tumbled on its insecure foundation, and a wave of the emperor's hand brought down a crash the whole edifice that was naught but an unsightly mass of ancient prejudices and new ideas. Villefort, therefore, gained nothing from the king but a gratitude which was not only useless but dangerous at the present time, and came cross of the Legion of Honor, which he had the prudence not to display. Napoleon would, doubtless, have dismissed Villefort but for the protection of Noirtier, who was all-powerful at the court of the 100 Days. The Procureur du Roi alone was deprived of his office, being under suspicion of lukewarm support of Bonaparte. Meanwhile, the imperial power had hardly been re-established, the emperor had hardly re-entered the Tuileries, and issued his numerous and divergent orders from that little cabinet into which we have introduced our readers, and on the table of which he found Louis XVIII's snuff-box, still open and half full, when the flames of civil war, always smoldering in the south, began to light up in Marseille, and the populace seemed like to indulge in acts of violence against the royalists of the town, in place of the shouts and insults which they hitherto had greeted them whenever they ventured abroad. Villefort retained his post, but his marriage was postponed until happier times. If the emperor remained on the throne, Gerard would require a different alliance, and his father undertook to find this for him. If, on the contrary, a second restoration brought back Louis XVIII, the influence of Monsieur de Saint-Méran and himself would be strengthened, and the marriage would be more suitable than ever. As for Dantes, he remained a prisoner, hidden away in the depths of his dungeon. He was ignorant of the downfall of Louis XVIII's throne and the re-establishment of Napoleon. Twice, during the short revival of the empire, which was called the 100 Days, had Monsieur Morel renewed his appeal for the liberation of Dantes, and each time Villefort had quieted him with promises and hopes. Finally, there was Waterloo. Morel did not present himself before Villefort anymore. He realized he had done all that was humanly possible for his young friend, and that to make any further attempts under this second restoration would be to compromise himself unnecessarily. When Louis XVIII returned to the throne, Villefort successfully petitioned for the post of Procureur du Roi at Toulouse, and a fortnight later he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran. When Napoleon returned to France, Danglars understood the full significance of the blow he had struck at Dantes. His denunciation had been given some sort of justification, and he called this extraordinary coincidence the hand of Providence. But when Napoleon reached Paris, and his voice was once more heard, imperious and powerful, Danglars grew afraid. Dantes might return any day with full information on the case of his arrest and eager for vengeance. He, therefore, informed Monsieur Morel of his desire to leave the merchant service, and obtained a recommendation from him to a Spanish merchant. He went to Madrid, and was heard of no more for a long time. Fernand, on the other hand, could not understand anything. Dantes was absent, and that was all he cared about. What had happened to him? He did not know, neither did he care. In the meantime, the empire made a last appeal to her soldiers, and every man capable of bearing arms rushed to obey the far-reaching voice of his emperor. Fernand left Mercedes and joined up with the others, but the gloomy and terrible thought preyed on his mind that Dantes might return now that his back was turned, and marry her whom he loved. His devotion to Mercedes, the pity he pretended to have for her in sorrow, the care with which he anticipated her least desire, had produced the effect that outward signs of devotion always produce on generous hearts. Mercedes had always been fond of him as a friend, and this affection was now increased by a feeling of gratitude. Fernand therefore went off to the army with hope in his heart, and Mercedes was now left alone. She could be seen, bathed in tears, wandering incessantly around the little village of the Catalans. At times she would stand under the fierce midday sun as motionless and dumb as a statue, with her eyes fixed on Marseille. At other times she would sit on the beach listening to the moaning of the sea, as eternal as her grief, and ask herself whether it would not be better to leap down into the abyss below than to suffer this cruel alternative of a hopeless suspense. She did not lack the courage to do this deed. It was her religion that came to her aid and saved her from suicide. As for old Dantes, he now had lost all hope. 5 months after he had been separated from his son, and almost at the very hour at which he had been arrested, the old man breathed his last in Mercédès' arms. Monsieur Morel paid the expenses of the funeral and the small debts the old man had incurred during his last illness. It required more than benevolence to do this. It required courage. The South was aflame, and to help the father of a Bonapartist as dangerous as Dantes, even though he were on his deathbed, was a crime. So, we will get to chapter 11 soon. Hope you all have a good day. See you later.